Hello and welcome to School-Based Studies, a virtual presentation by Solutions IRB. This is one of the topics of our recent Lunch and Learn sessions, and if you were unable to attend that session, we've got this brief overview recorded here for you. When we think about studies in school or educational settings, we need to consider the complexity of the studies and a lot of the considerations that researchers need to take into account when they're designing the study, obtaining permissions, and submitting for IRB review. It's important that researchers think through student safety as well as what will be asked of students. So we want to avoid any situation where researchers are going to be alone with a student or any increase to risk. The type of information or data, whether this is sensitive, personal, identifiable, these all need to be taken into consideration as well. It's important that researchers are basing the design of their study on district and principal permissions, what the schools will or will not allow as part of research conducted in their organizations. We often think of exempt category 1 when we talk about research in educational settings. The definition from CFR is research conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings that specifically involves normal educational practices that are not likely to adversely impact students' opportunity to learn required educational content or the assessment of educators who provide instruction. This includes most research on regular and special educational instructional strategies and research on the effectiveness of or the comparison among instructional techniques, curricula, or classroom management methods. As such, researchers need to think through whether or not their studies fall under exempt category 1 and also consider anything that is in your research design that might take you outside of this exempt category 1 based on these requirements. There are aspects of research design that will increase the review level and increase the potential risk to participants. This would include any time there is control and treatment groups in the research design, anytime that researchers are conducting focus groups with students. It's important to keep in mind that this necessarily increases the risk of breach of confidentiality because the students will know other students and what they provided as data in those focus group settings. Any time that students will be taken away from their normal classroom setting or their normal educational instruction is going to increase review level. If researchers are evaluating programs that are not considered normal educational practices or that don't fall under normal curricula or course learning content, that will increase review level as well. And any time that researchers are asking teachers to recruit their own students or to assent their own students to participate, it's important to keep in mind that this can pose an undue influence on students to feel the need to participate. Researchers should keep in mind that adults and particularly teachers in a classroom are in an authoritative position over the students, and we need to make sure that we're not exuding any sort of pressure from that teacher-student relationship in obtaining student assent to participate in the study. Obtaining permission letters from the schools, districts, superintendents, principals, whomever it might be. This is also an important consideration in research. Permissions are granted by schools or districts on case-by-case basis. And the IRB is going to need to verify that the researchers have documentation of what is permissible, what is allowed by the schools, and how that site permission will be obtained. In some cases, districts will leave it to the individual principal of each school to decide whether or not they're willing to allow the participation of their teachers or students in the research study. So the IRB will always be looking for documentation or evidence of what it is that the schools are allowing the researchers to do as part of the study. Anytime that documentation or evidence is not able to be obtained, the IRB will fall back on needing both district and principal permission letters. So, again, we're always erring on the side of caution and the greatest protection of participants. So if we don't have documentation that says it's not required from the district or it's not required from the principal, we're going to need documentation from both of them. It's important also for researchers to keep in mind that the more detailed and specific you can be on these permission letters, the better. This allows not only for the districts, the principals granting the permission, but also for the IRB when you submit for review, so that it's clearly articulated exactly what the schools are allowing you to do in terms of the study activities and the data that is being collected. So if it's something that includes asking for administrative data or student records, rather than just using general terms like that, specify if we're asking for grades or attendance records or gender identity of students or whatever it might be, so that it's very specific, cumulative GPA, so that it's very clear. That also allows us to determine if this falls under other certain protections like FERPA regulations and things like that. So the more detailed and specific researchers can be in obtaining these permission letters, the better. Another important consideration is determining whether active parental consent is required or whether passive parental consent is appropriate or acceptable. And so researchers need to carefully consider this as well. We recommend that you start by checking with the district. A lot of schools have guidelines on this, and some districts will require active parental consent, a wet signature on a piece of paper, and sometimes the only way they'll allow that is by students taking the paper home and bringing it back with the parent signature on there. So it's important that you understand what is going to be required specifically based on where you're conducting the research. It's also important to consider the FERPA regulations and the data protected, information protected by FERPA. Anytime that researchers are actively collecting data from students, that active parental consent is required. Consideration should also be made for PPRA, which is the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. This regulation protects 8 specific areas of information, and anytime researchers are going to collect data from any of these 8 areas, parental consent is required, and that's active parental consent is required before information can be collected. A lot of times we see a request for passive parental consent in education studies, and it's understood that sometimes it's difficult to get the students to take the paper home, to get the parents to sign it and bring it back in order to get the participation. But researchers should also, consider the different ways that it might be possible to obtain active parental consent. Anytime that this is feasible, it's always a more appropriate way to go. We want to avoid passive parental consent unless it's absolutely necessary. And again, that's always going to require that the research involves no greater than minimal risk to participants. Anytime that, it's not going to adversely affect the rights or the welfare of those participants, and we'll fall back on whether it could be or could not be practicably carried out without that waiver of consent or active parental consent as well. The type of information and data collected and the type of research activities that students will be asked to engage in is always going to be a consideration as well. But researchers should also keep in mind that even if passive parental consent is appropriate or permissible, those forms that are sent home to the parents must include all of the relevant information. A passive parental consent form should look almost identical to an active parental consent form, so that we're not just providing a quick blurb overview of this, and if you're not comfortable with it, tell us. We want to be articulating everything out about the study activities and everything that would be in an active consent form, so that those parents, even in a passive parental consent, still have full information to make that fully informed decision about whether or not they will agree to allow their student to participate in the study. And of course, there are several considerations when we are considering student assent and how to obtain student assent. As stated previously, we want to avoid any person in a position of authority gaining consent. Sometimes, we fall back on teachers to get that assent from the students to participate, but we also need to take into consideration any potential for undue influence or coercion as a result of that authoritative position, or a student wanting to please their teacher or do what is asked of them by their teacher. It's not specific to students and teachers either. Of course, anytime we're asking, the districts to recruit their principals or the principals to recruit their teachers, we still have that authority. We still have someone's boss asking them to do something. So we need to consider that as well, and any potential undue influence that might occur or even be perceived to occur in those types of situations. Researchers need to avoid any sort of student assent in a group setting. So we don't want to ask everyone in the classroom at one time. If you're interested in participating, raise your hand. Students need to be able to receive the information about the study and make a decision about whether or not they assent to participate privately and without the knowledge of everyone else in the classroom. This also, takes us back to protecting confidentiality. It's potentially coercive or undue influence when students see who in the class is willing to participate or who is not. There can be an element of peer pressure there. But also, it's important that researchers are adequately protecting the confidentiality of those that are participating and even those that are not, because it is in that classroom setting. And again, anytime we're having a waiver of documentation, so we might want to do student surveys, online student surveys, and we may have the assent form that they click through to access the survey. So, they've been provided the information, they're giving assent by clicking through, but we're not documenting that assent. It's still very important that all of the elements of assent are there and that they are allowed to make that decision privately and outside of any sort of a group setting. But anytime we are thinking about waiving documentation or requesting a waiver of documentation, those elements should be included as well. And then again, we sometimes see studies where we're including high school seniors, and that might include some students who are over the age of 18. And in most cases, these individuals are still considered students. They're still considered minor because they are still in school. And so they would still also be subject to parental consent and assent. But it's also very important that you are checking with any applicable state laws as well. The age of majority is not the same in every state, and there are some different rules, regulations, and laws that surround that depending on where it is that researchers will be conducting their studies. And finally, we'd like to provide you with some tips and suggestions as researchers developing your studies or preparing or planning to submit for IRB review. Always keep in mind, if it's going to be obvious which students in a classroom are participating in the study, remember this impacts the confidentiality of the participants. And consider what the students will be doing who are not participating in the study while others are engaged in those study activities. As researchers, we tend to focus on our own studies, what we'll be doing, how we'll be doing it, what we'll be asking of the participants, what data we'll be collecting from them. But particularly in an educational setting, we also need to consider what will be going on while the students who are in the study are taking part in the activities. What are those other students who are not in the study going to be doing? So that's also important to keep in mind. Another thing to think about too is even if the students are not the participants, sometimes we want to observe the teachers delivering a certain type of instructional technique or curriculum. And so researchers want to do observations. You also need to take into consideration, is this observation going to include the students? And if so, then they are considered participants in the study, and all of that will apply as well. If you're doing observations of the students as participants in the study, how are you going to account for and address the students who are not going to be in the study? And again, we don't want to be separating them in halves or taking them out of the classroom, parading them away, so that we are doing everything possible to protect that confidentiality. And it's just something always to keep in mind. Anyone who's not in the study, what will they be doing? And you always want to provide that information to the parents as well on those consent forms. Consider whether the study activities occur during normal educational instruction time, and also whether they are normal educational practices. We want to avoid taking students away from their normal education or instruction. We don't want to ask students to give up their lunch time to participate in our research studies. Those are very important considerations as well. And again, is what we are studying or the activities considered normal educational practices as defined in that Exempt 1 definition. And just like in the site permission letters from the schools, researchers should be very specific in the IRB application and materials as to what information or data will be collected. So for example, again, rather than just writing student records or administrative data, specify exactly what it is that will be collected. Cumulative GPA, gender identity, course grade, student attendance records, discipline records, whatever it might be. It's important that we have this information not only for parents to be able to decide whether they want to provide consent or students to give assent to this, but also to see how this is impacted based on FERPA and PPR regulations as well. And researchers should always keep those in mind as guidelines for the studies and the information that is being collected. So again, the more detail, the better. It always allows for a more cohesively designed study. Specificity in those permission letters is important, and detail in your IRB application facilitates the review process as well. So hopefully, we'd like to thank you for listening to our brief overview of school-based studies, and hopefully you found this informational. Please be sure to visit www.solutionsirb.com for more information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at correspondence@solutionsirb.com, or you can call us by telephone at 855-226-4472. Thank you.